You can't hustle the Crustle, so they say, and that must be why the patrons have chosen it for this month. It's not a Pokemon that has received much attention from fans. It's one of those solid Pokemon that linger in the background, helping make up the greater picture of its surroundings. I say that as if it's not a Pokemon Unite character. Indeed, Crustle was one of the many Pokemon introduced in Generation 5's Unova region, which featured the greatest number of new additions since the first generation. Most Black and White players were familiar with its pre-evolution Dwebble, which was featured on Gym Leader Berg's team, but those who faced him in Black and White 2's Pokemon World Tournament would come face to face with the fully evolved form. Today we're going to examine if Crustle was able to hustle its way to any sort of success in the competitive scene. And so we ask, how good was Crustle actually? And in this video we'll be going over these competitive formats. Players looked at Crustle with an interested side eye upon its debut in Generation 5. Sure, with its stats, it was hardly looking like it was going to become a top-tier OU Titan, but it also had a lot to like. Access to spikes always raises an eyebrow, as it is such an amazing move. Pokemon have become viable almost purely off of being able to use it, and Crustle also had Stealth Rock on top of that, meaning it was a huge potential player in the hazard game. Additionally, it also had one of the most vicious boosting moves in the game, the attack and speed doubling Shell Smash, or Shell Break as it was known in its earliest translation from Japanese in the initial days of Black and White. Anyway, whether Iwaparesu, as it was also known in those early days, was hazard stacking or shell smashing, both variants loved the fact that Crustle had a built-in focus sash thanks to its sturdy ability, which helped downplay the dropping of defenses Shell Smash brought with it, as well as allowing Crustle to run another item instead of sash to diversify its potential to execute its strategy. Most notably, Custat Berry was the go-to on the hazard stacker, so that the slow Crustle could bypass its low speed and get both rocks and spikes in the face of something that would knock it down to 1 HP. While the Shell Smasher enjoyed Lumberry to guard it against otherwise ruinous burns and paralysis. However, Crustle also had a fair few flaws, and unfortunately, they were not insignificant. It was a decent suicide lead, but there were plenty of other Pokemon who could do the immediate rocks and spikes role, even in the lower tiers. This wouldn't count Crustle out from contention in and of itself, but competition would be cutthroat, especially as it had to contend with a low speed stat, whose force reliance on Custat Berry prevented it from running something like Lumberry to guard against early sleep, or Mental Herb to guard against the hazard blocking taunt. Meanwhile, as a Shell Smash sweeper, Crustle had potential. It hit hard with a strong stab combination, striking many Pokemon super effectively, with Earthquake rounding out its coverage perfectly against Steel types, but it also had many factors interfering with its ability to actually live up to this potential in practice. At base 95 attack, it was certainly not weak, but it wasn't crushing everything in sight after one boost as was required of such a do-or-die sweeper in order to be effective. It was also not difficult to stop Crustle from setting up, because it was incredibly slow and utterly riddled with weaknesses. That whole sturdy letting it survive any hit thing worked consistently for the hazard stacker because it was meant to lead off, but it was a lot more difficult to keep the field hazard free later in the game, and Crustle being weak to the omnipresent Stealth Rock made this issue particularly nasty. Of course, it also was quite specially frail, and its great base defense wouldn't take it too far with its meager base HP alongside its lack of any investment in bulk required of such an offensive set. Finally, its aforementioned speed, or rather its lack thereof, was so bad that even at +2, it was incredibly easy to outrun it with just about any Choice Scarfer. Of course, none of these issues were insurmountable, but the fact that there were so many and that each of them were so prominent and exploitable made pulling off a successful Shell Smash Crustle sweep intensely difficult. With these issues in mind, it should come as no surprise that Crustle tumbled past OU and UU as well with nary a thought to its use. It came to a stop in RU, where the surrounding game was more hospitable, and there it eked out a niche. Eked out really does describe it, as Crustle really didn't have much of an impact on the tier. If you wanted your spiking lead to also have Stealth Rock, you were generally going to run Smeargle, which was much faster and was able to shut an opposing Pokemon down with Spore. Crustle's advantages, greater bulk, and more threatening stabs didn't really come into use much when its role was to get up rocks and spikes. It technically had things it could do Smeargle couldn't, like potentially using its multi-hit Rock Blast to smash through Scoliped's Focus Sash and limit it to one lair, or using its good physical bulk to prevent Chinchino's multi-hit barrage and denying its hazards altogether, but this was barely more useful than the fact that it hit the common lead Uxie super effectively with X-Scissor, which is to say, not very. These advantages weren't nearly enough to outweigh Smeargle being better for the role they were competing for, as they were either incredibly specific or just not as valuable as getting more hazards in the case of the Uxie matchup. What about Shell Smash? Forget it. Even more unreliable than the hazard stacker. Not even worth a thought. At least with a bad version of Smeargle, you'd still get a hazard or two, whereas the Smash variant was just going to be a wasted team slot. Impossible to set up and impossible to sweep even if it did manage to set up. Crustle was really more suited to NU territory, and indeed the NU player base was very excited about the possibility of it joining the tier, but sadly it never came to pass, and thus Crustle languished rather haplessly in RU, and its usage was kept afloat for the reason that it was usable, and dual hazards and Shell Smash seemed alluring enough, so it tempted many players, especially newer ones. It wasn't the worst thing you could use, but there was a reason why it wasn't being used by tournament players in serious matches. If you're being optimal, you're not using Crustle. Power creep ensured Crustle wasn't to get anywhere near RU in Gen 6, but also meant it wasn't going to hack it in NU this time around either. Fortunately, Gen 6 is also where the PU tier came into existence, and Crustle found a decent niche. Smeargle was also in the tier, but it was held back by the fact that grass types could no longer be slept by Spore, making counterplay much easier to come by. Suicide hazard leads were a tougher proposition as a whole in the age of buff defog, but this was where another advantage of Crustle's came in handy: its longevity. Well, compared to Smeargle anyway. It could actually switch into the common defog Vullaby and relayed hazards, while threatening spikes to set it apart from Golem. Crustle's spike stacking was also particularly apt against teams relying on Rapid Spin Armaldo, as his fellow bug rock type wouldn't want to get stung by Crustle's strong stabbed Stone Edge. Crustle's access to a buff knockoff and good physical bulk meant it could also effortlessly mess with another common hazard remover, the Eviolite reliant defog Vibrava. It didn't love the prospect of going one-on-one with defog Prinplup, but nor did the recovery lacking Prinplup relish the idea of losing its Eviolite and taking subsequent damage, especially because it couldn't even prevent Crustle from having a hazard up when it fainted, which was all Crustle's team needed in that situation. As always, Shell Smash Crustle was incredibly unreliable and thus almost unseen, as it was far too easy to stop its sweep with priority and Scarfers, to say nothing of preventing its setup to begin with. But hey, Crustle was legit this time around, so all in all, Crustle's limitations meant it was on the rarer side, especially in high-level tournament play, but it was a genuinely decent choice in ORAS PU, a marked improvement on its outing in the previous generation. There was hope for Crustle in Generation 7 before a single game had been played, as it was revealed to have received a significant extra base 10 attack, bringing it up to a legitimately solid base 105. In terms of power, its Shell Smash set would no longer be left wanting for any, as it would now be sufficiently capable of blasting through nearly everything in sight, as was required of such a sweeper. Now it was just as powerful as the lower tier smashing Barbacle. As if that wasn't enough, Gen 7's addition of Z-moves meant Crustle would become even more powerful. But sadly, this did not translate to any sort of competitive success for many reasons. Crustle's many other non-power problems interfering with the success of a Shell Smash sweep, problems that had already been more significant, had not been ameliorated. Furthermore, Gen 7 saw PU shaken up by such power creep as to become unrecognizable from its previous iteration. Crustle had only been decent in ORAS and didn't stand a chance in this new metagame. Shell Smash, as always, was out of the question. This time, it was even outclassed by Amistar, Turtonator, and Caracasa, and as a hazard stacker, also outclassed entirely, completely, 100% by Amistar, which was faster, more threatening, and just generally a better Pokemon. Using Crustle was actively harming your chances to win. It was so objectively out and out worse than its competition. Well, theoretically, you could make the argument that using such an outclassed Pokemon could be used as a psychological trick on the opponent, fooling them into thinking they were playing someone worse, and then somehow taking advantage of that. Yeah, as funny as that is to imagine, it certainly didn't happen in practice. Never say never and all, but the fact remained that Crustle was devoid of viability and usage, and thus dropped to untiered status. Generation 8's deck set meant Crustle was the most viable it had ever been by a long shot, with less competition. For the first time ever, it was actually viable in UU, as it used a combination of Shell Smash and both entry hazards alongside Rock Blast or Stone Edge. Its goal wasn't to sweep, but in the event that a hazard remover would try to get rid of its hazards, it'd boost up and threaten it, allowing it to go down having maintained at least one hazard. Now make no mistake, it was far from good or common, but it was a legitimate, decent niche. Of course, being viable in UU does not a UU Pokemon make, and Crustle plummeted through the tiering rung. At first, it was thought it might settle down in NU, but the minor hype around it dissipated as the player base quickly realized it was as flawed as ever. Having failed to live up to its early promise, Crustle dropped to PU. In the earliest stages of Generation 8 PU, Crustle was a genuinely solid Pokemon, the most viable it had ever been in any tier. It found its home on hyper offense teams. It could be a good lead with rocks and spikes, but for the first time ever, it was its Shell Smash slash variant that was its go-to. Thanks to heavy-duty boots, it was able to utilize sturdy anytime in the game, hazards or no hazards, and this was enormous. It might not sweep, but it was able to reliably dish out a lot of damage, as it was able to blast through staples like Alolan Dugtrio, Galarian Mr. Mime, Mr. Rhyme, and Unpheasant. It was far from flawless, of course, as Throw was absolutely everywhere and ate Crustle up, so it needed to be part of a team effort to collectively overwhelm Throw alongside threats like Savali Ice, Dreadnought, and Alolan Dugtrio. Hyper Offense was a solid, consistent playstyle in the tier, and Crustle was regularly a consistent contributor to it, at long last. And then the DLCs came, and that was that. In the power-crept environment of the expanded Pokedex, Crustle was nowhere near as comparatively impressive as it had been in the early stages. Some players tried to get its Shell Smash set to work again, but the magic was gone, and they quickly abandoned it. Crustle unceremoniously dropped to untiered once again, and it's a genuine shame it ended Generation 8 so poorly after it had gotten off to such a great start. But alas. And that's it. So how good was Crustle actually? Well, Crustle is a sad case of a generally poor Pokemon with a few items of incredible interest in its otherwise meager bag of tricks. Items so incredible you think this thing must work at least a little bit, but time and time again, it isn't able to make anything of itself. It's had a frustrating competitive history where almost every potential spot of viability was stifled. It wasn't even fortunate enough to drop to NU in Gen 5, instead languishing in RU. It made somewhat of a niche for itself in Gen 6 PU, thankfully. A limited one, but a legitimately decent one nonetheless. Then in Gen 7, it finally dropped to the tier that had been threatening and looming over its head forever, untiered. It even received an attack boost that gen, but it was for naught, as it needed far more than that to stand a chance as the game got stronger over time. It had a great start in the limited Pokedex of early Generation 8, seeing viability as high as UU and forming a genuinely good niche in PU, but then the DLCs came around and relegated it to permanent untiered status again. So overall, Crustle's competitive history has been decidedly mediocre. Hopefully, Game Freak looks more favorably upon it in the future. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Crustle? How would you buff it? Does it really needs it? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.